Türkiye, Russia and Ukraine have signed a deal brokered by the United Nations to get millions of tons of Ukrainian grain flowing once again from its Black Sea ports, which have been blockaded by Russia. The two countries are ranked among the top 3 grain producers in the world before the conflict began in February. Now about a third of their exports have been trapped in ports. Let's take a closer look at why these countries are so important to the global food supply chain. Russia and Ukraine are both leading suppliers of foodstuffs and fertilizers to global markets. An estimated 400 million people worldwide rely on Ukrainian food. Before the war, 30% of global wheat exports, 31% of barley and 60% of sunflower oil came from Russia and Ukraine. Many of Ukraine and Russia's exports go to developing countries that have already been struggling with food shortages. The UN has warned the fighting could worsen crises and cause long-term famines in places like Yemen and Afghanistan. Wheat prices, which were already 49% above their pre-pandemic average, have risen by another 30% since the war in Ukraine began. The price of sunflower oil increased 22% in the first month of the war. Some fear that if prices continue to rise at the same rate, it'll trigger political unrest and mass migration. Well, let's get more on this now with economist Taha Arvas. He's an adjunct professor of finance at Bogazici University, and he joins us now from the Turkish city of Van. Good to have you back with us, Taha. A huge breakthrough in Istanbul. We know the Turkish government had been working furiously behind the scenes to get this done. Right. Now that we have a deal, what could this mean for this growing global food crisis?
This is potentially a solution to this major crisis, as you pointed out. We're talking about 1/3 of global wheat exports come from Ukraine and Russia. So to have these millions of tons of grains of wheat and fertilizer waiting at these Black Sea ports and not being able to be shipped out, exported because of apprehensions that both sides have was a major blow. This is the world's breadbasket, so it's a major. This will be a major relief to food prices, hopefully, and to those countries, especially those poorer countries who are in dire need of these exports. So it's a major step.
Yes, and at the heart of this deal is this so-called coordination center that will be set up in Istanbul. Now, it'll apparently be staffed by Ukrainian, Russian, UN and Turkish officials to make sure that not just one power has complete control over these exports. But do you think this deal will work with such a plan in place?
I think it will, only because everyone has so much to lose here. The United Nations has so much to lose because all these member nations are in need of these exports. Ukraine is sitting on millions of tons of wheat exports that it needs to move immediately. These are perishable; they can't just sit there forever. Russia, similarly, needs to export fertilizer and the wheat that it has. So everyone has so much to lose here. It was a major game of chicken, unfortunately, but I think cooler heads prevailed, and the deal was done.
Now, Ukraine and Western powers have put the blame for this growing food crisis at Russia's doorstep. They say that Russia is blockading the Black Sea ports and therefore millions of tons of grain are being prevented from escaping. But Moscow, on the other hand, has flipped the script and blamed Western powers, saying that it's Western sanctions that are preventing Russian food and fertilizer from being exported and that it's Ukraine's mines in the Black Sea that's preventing them from reopening those ports. Who is to blame here, do you think?
Right. So that's an interesting point. I think what happened was when the invasion of Ukraine occurred, Western powers, the EU, United States, etc., you potentially jumped the gun with sanctions on Russia without really thinking it through, because Russia is such a major exporter of oil and gas, natural gas, and all these things like fertilizer and wheat, that if you sanction the country, if you don't allow your companies to do business with Russia, how are they going to import these natural resources that you so desperately need? So in this instance, they needed to come to a solution to kind of like remove or delay sanctions, really, or allow these Russian goods to be exported. So Who's to blame? That's the billion-dollar question. It's ironically in Ukraine's best interest here. This situation is in Ukraine's best interest only because, frankly, and I'm very sad to say this, but the war in the invasion of Ukraine has fallen away from the headlines. It's we're not hearing it as much as we used to hear about it a few months ago. Europe really doesn't care anymore. Europe is worried about its natural gas prices, its oil prices. People are worried about how much you're paying at the pump. It's and we just heard there was comments from the head of MI6 yesterday, Richard Moore, who said more Russians have died in these last 6 months than the 8-year war in Afghanistan, which, if you can believe it, that's an amazing number. So this is a major armed conflict. It's not something to dismiss here. But like I said, it's many news outlets have stopped covering it or have drastically decreased their coverage. So in other words, it's in Ukraine's interest to bring the war back to everyone's doorstep, to remind them that it's not just Ukraine who's suffering here. So am I saying it's obviously Ukraine to blame? No, obviously not. It's not. Ukraine is not to blame. However, both sides, Russia is the invader, so Russia should be the main person here to blame. But Ukraine needs to bring attention to the situation. And I think it may have done that here.
And as you say, let's hope that this deal does result in the price of grain falling so that those countries who rely on it the most can get their hands on it. Taha Arvas, good to get your thoughts as always. Thank you for that.
My pleasure.